Hello, my name is Xenophon Papadimitris. I'm a professor in radiology and biomedical imaging and biomedical engineering at Yale. This interview is part of a collection of conversations with experts in medical software from academia, industry, and regulatory agencies, and is supplementary material for a Coursera class Introduction to Medical Software that will appear in the fall of 2021. So our guest today is Mr. Tom Renner, who is a quality efficiency and regulatory affairs consultant with Vision 28. And our topic is cybersecurity, which is a very hot topic right now if anybody follows the news. So Tom, thanks for joining us, and please introduce yourself.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Tom Renner. I'm with Vision 28. I have now 25 years of experience in the medical device field, 20 of those in industry and then 5 consulting thereafter. In industry, I've spent time both as a hardware engineering manager and a software engineering manager, and as well as developing quality systems and leading a team creating medical device software. So I'm happy to join you and share just a little bit about cybersecurity today.
If anybody looks at the news, you'll see the incidents. Colonial Pipeline, there was a radiation treatment device that was cloud-based and had to shut down radiation treatment on patients. We had it here in New Haven. I'm sure others have had similar issues. So let's talk about cybersecurity as a risk management process and just outline a little bit of what this means. What does that imply? How do you account for cybersecurity in your risk management, in your design? We'll go back and forth, I assume.
It is a process. And so just like risk of other sorts of injury, risk of cybersecurity events is something you should be thinking about and planning for throughout the life cycle of your product or products. So rather than taking a naive approach where you maybe ignore it and hope you never get unlucky, or maybe you just make a brief list of threats when you're writing requirements, you imagine a couple of threats and write them down and call it good, or maybe you hire an external company when you have your finished product to do some penetration testing to give you some sort of certificate. Those are naive approaches, and a much better approach is to plan for cybersecurity when you're planning for your product, to develop for cybersecurity as you're developing your product, and to surveil, post-market surveillance for cybersecurity issues as your product's on the market. So that means having a plan so that you can get started early. As you're thinking about requirements and overall design, you should be thinking about cybersecurity. It then means assessing vulnerabilities at the requirements stage and later, and not just making a list of some imagined threats, but thinking about the architecture and the components and what their vulnerabilities might be, performing that analysis and doing testing of those components. You may need to do unit testing of chips or software functional units or software libraries at the low level, the individual component level, or then at subsystem or whole product levels. That would then give you assurance that you had hardened your product against the known vulnerabilities. You want to have some sort of report of that analysis and those findings and those mitigations and the testing, so that, as we talked about earlier, if you risk losing institutional knowledge, you have a report that you can go back to and say, this is why we chose this chipset. There was a reason related to security why we didn't choose supplier B or product B. So that security report is very important. And then it's important that you have the post-market surveillance, the ongoing assessment of vulnerabilities as your product's in the market, because chips or software are always being probed, poked, and weakened. New techniques come along, new resourceful hackers come along. And so what was true when you designed your product is not necessarily true when it's been on the market for 2 or 3 years. But this is all really important to do in a methodical fashion, because cybersecurity affects your choice of components, your choice of suppliers, your ability to get market clearance. FDA, among others, are keenly aware of cybersecurity issues and have put out recent guidance and are thinking about how to improve that guidance, even as we're speaking. So trying to get market clearance with an ignorant approach or ignoring cybersecurity entirely is going to be difficult. And then sales of the product. If your product has a reputation for being insecure, you're going to have a hard time making it past procurement for medical facilities. And customers are going to be unhappy. So it is important to think about your reputation and your ability to sell, not just your regulatory clearance.
Let me actually stop you here. Thanks. One of the things that strikes me about cybersecurity, as opposed to any of the other issues that we've dealt with, we deal with in a medical software. So in a medical software, you develop it, you show it's safe, you show it's effective for what it does. You know, it detects cancer at X-ray. The cybersecurity aspect, it's safe for today, but it may not be safe for tomorrow, correct? Like as new threats come online. So how does the regulation account for that? So do you lose your clearance at some point? Is this like an ongoing review as new threats come about, or are they thinking along those terms?
The FDA has guidance about post-market management of cybersecurity in medical devices. And so a cybersecurity event is much like any other unwanted event in that it may be severe enough that it requires adverse event reporting, where you have to tell FDA this horrible thing happened with our product. And you can imagine if there are enough of those adverse events and those horrible reports, or even a single event that is so horrible in its scope. And this is an interesting difference with cybersecurity. You can have a single event that affects every single user of the product, whereas a failure of a component in a single electric toothbrush is not going to affect every user of every toothbrush. But yes, if there are enough adverse events or enough bad press, as it were, FDA's focus and their likelihood of auditing you will increase if they find that you are not managing cybersecurity for your device. Then they may have objections and write you nonconformities on an inspection report that you'll then be obligated to fix.
Right, because it's an ongoing process. It's not products that finish with. So in the notes, when we're talking about this and planning this, you had this line, think like a hacker, don't think like an engineer. So if you could elaborate on that a little bit. So how do you go about doing cybersecurity design?
So an engineer's job is to find the best possible way to solve a problem, broadly speaking. Best possible way, technically, financially, politically, within the constraints of the company and their market. And so engineers get in the habit of thinking that way. What's the best option? What's the best solution? What's the best way to do this? Whereas someone who's trying to penetrate your device, violate its security, its cybersecurity, is looking for any possible way to achieve that goal. So they aren't, their thinking is unconstrained in the way that engineers tend to constrain themselves. They're looking for vulnerabilities of a variety of types to find and exploit. And if any one of those gets them where they want to be, that's great. So they might steal someone's authentication information, actually steal their username and password. Or they might modify data in a database in hopes that it will be uploaded to a target where they're trying to get access. Or they might take advantage of the lack of authentication when doing certain activities to deny that they were the ones who did that activity. Or they might just steal databases or information and pour through it, looking for juicy bits that they can sell to credit card spoofers. Or they might take your device and break it apart and take the firmware out of the chip and decompile the firmware and look for vulnerabilities in the firmware that will then inform them how they can attack an unviolated device that hasn't been torn to bits. So this is a different way of thinking, to think, how could I get this to work? As opposed to how can I make this reliable and efficient and ready for sale. It's a different way of thinking about the world.
So what is the design process as you think about cybersecurity? And you have some thoughts about, how do you go through the process? I assume it's a very similar process to risk management in many ways, but how do we go through it?
It's really similar. And as I said, it should start at about the same time you're thinking about other types of product risk, which is when you're just proposing your system design at first. And there are a variety of ways to do it, but the first thing you should do is be thinking about the modules and components, hardware or software, of your proposed system and what their vulnerabilities might be. One way to do that is Microsoft's threat modeling tool that has a very large database of components and their known vulnerabilities if they were used with no mitigation at all. So you can generate a list of known vulnerabilities for the components of your proposed design. Some of those vulnerabilities will be irrelevant to you if you aren't using that component in that way, if you're not using that portion of that software library, or if you're not using those features of that chipset. So you can score the list of vulnerabilities and discard a bunch of them as irrelevant or not applicable to your design. But then there are going to be some portions of your design that have known vulnerabilities. And as you think about those, you'll think about how to mitigate those vulnerabilities. Consider then whether they've been mitigated enough, and describe what the residual risk is in a security report. So this is very similar to the risk analysis for other types of harm, where you describe the vulnerabilities, assess their severity, mitigate them to an acceptable level, and document the residual risks. The same process.
So what does the process look like when you go to the FDA or any other regulatory agency? What do they expect to see in a pre-market submission now? I mean, so you've presumably it's the same as risk management. I want to see that you've worried about it, but what specifically are we looking at here?
So they have a guidance. It's called the Content of Pre-Market Submissions for Management of Cybersecurity and Medical Devices, which is fairly recent, 2018. They are definitely working on a new version. So you have to aim at the current target, but understand that the FDA is actively reevaluating that guidance, trying to improve it. The guidance as it currently stands has you classify the type of device you have based on its potential for harm from a cybersecurity event, and then apply a variety of mitigations based on known vulnerabilities. So very similar to the process of assessing your device, assessing vulnerabilities, and mitigating them that you'd be doing anyways. FDA's guidance, however, has a particular terminology and a particular structure that is fairly detailed and allows you to just follow that structure in documenting your submission or the cybersecurity part of your submission.
So the final part of this discussion, I guess, let's talk a little bit about the post-market phase. So the device now is on the market. You've managed to do things well enough for the FDA to let you go through with that. But of course, you're never done with the device. The device is alive for as long as it's used by somebody. What is your post-market strategy now for cybersecurity? And I guess in part, how to make sure that a small thing doesn't blow up to become a big thing in many ways, right?
Well, you do have that, hopefully, have that security report that summarizes your previous work and the known vulnerabilities and your mitigations. That's your starting point, and that's a document that you'd want to update and maintain as a living document moving forward. To do that, you monitor the components that you use for new disclosures of vulnerabilities. And there are national registries of cybersecurity known vulnerabilities where you can do that. You don't have to be doing the research in a completely independent fashion. They're reported. As you are aware of new vulnerabilities that might affect you, you review those for their impact and applicability to your product. It may be that they are a component you use, but the vulnerability is in an area that isn't relevant to you, and you can simply acknowledge it and move on. But assuming that it was a vulnerability that could have an impact, you then need to implement changes to improve mitigation, or notify customers if that was the only mitigation that you could perform, or both if you could take both activities. Update your security report, and there might be a cycle of introspection through corrective and preventive action to think about why you missed this before. And it may be the answer is nobody knew about this vulnerability. But if there's an underlying reason why your process was flawed and caused you to miss this, it would be nice to fix that to reduce your exposure in future. So monitor, assess, make changes, tell people about it, update your report.
Okay, thanks. I guess that's the last question on cybersecurity. What do you find are the biggest misconceptions that people have, right? I mean, you know, if I put my hat on as somebody who designs software, I'm interested in doing the good things that a medical software package, right? I want to find cancer in an image, I want to quantify things. But what are the misconceptions about cybersecurity? What do you find are things that people don't understand and you wish they did, or before they start talking to you, as advice to students who get into this field, I guess?
It's that engineer versus the hacker, and the thinking within the box when you shouldn't. So that the example about someone breaking apart your device to access the firmware in your chip and decompile it to figure out what your code looks like, that's not an imaginary problem. People do that, and thinking, oh well, that device is hot plate welded. The enclosure is sealed. There is no way someone's going to get in that. They can't access any of the chips inside. It's just wrong, because someone can go take a saw and chop it open. So thinking in absolutes or thinking inside the box, thinking, oh, that requires authentication. No one's going to break that. Well, someone could steal the credentials. They can go to your desk and look under your keyboard where you keep your username and password on a Post-it note and steal it. Or thinking, oh, that's encrypted. It's safe. Well, maybe it's not encrypted at all stages in the device, and somebody could access it at a stage that you weren't intending them to access it. Or saying, oh, that's so difficult, nobody would do that. People do this for fun. People do it for commercial reasons and big business and governmental reasons, but people hack for fun, and something impractical might be just the sort of challenge they're looking for. And then the final one is, nobody would ever think of that. Nobody will notice that. It's hidden, it's obfuscated, it's safe because nobody knows it. That's just a matter of time till somebody knows it. So those sorts of inside the box thoughts and absolute thinking are weak points in any cybersecurity approach.
Okay, Tom, thanks for all the information you provided us for today. Hopefully we'll open some people's eyes as to the central importance of this topic. It's a major aspect of the risk management process for all medical software right now. And, you know, hopefully we'll educate some people along the way. Thank you.
Thanks.